All right. So I've been gone for a little while. I'm sorry about that. And I am coming back with a simple audio recording podcast episode. This is because I am completely exhausted. I was helping my daughter move. She just moved out. It was a lot of work. I would say emotionally as well as practically and physically. So I'm just kind of, trying to recover from all of that, trying to get my house in order. It's been taking a little while. But I didn't want to just do nothing because I don't know. I don't like when I feel like, I guess nothing is coming and I'm feeling guilty. Okay, I'm feeling guilty. That's the truth. That's the fucking truth. So here's the thing about guilt. No, I'm just kidding. But the episode that we're doing today is about guilt, which is already annoying because even saying today's episode is about guilt and shame kind of makes me feel like I should apologize for bringing the mood down. So I'm sorry. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. That is the whole problem. Because the episode is not going to be about how to become like a better or cleaner or more morally optimized person. Like, this is not going to be a guide to feeling guilt in a healthy, productive, or emotionally intelligent way at all. So if that's what you're here for, please turn around. I don't want you to be able to return to society as a more efficient little guilt machine with better boundaries and a fucking a daily journal or something. This episode is a critique of guilt and shame themselves. And I'm not doing this because guilt and shame are always fake or something, or they shouldn't be considered as valid emotions or valid states. I'm also not doing this because I think remorse is useless or because hurting people doesn't matter, which is something that, of course, we as egoists are commonly accused of. I'm not saying you can never act badly, or you never owe anyone any repair, or you never need to apologize, or you never need to change. I'm not trying to justify anything. But what I'm trying to do here is show that guilt and shame are more than just feelings, that they are mechanisms, they are systems, they are networks, they are processes of some kind, and they do something to us. And what they do, this is my claim, is they turn judgment inward. They make us watch ourselves. They make us shrink before anyone else has to actually ask us to shrink. They make us confuse suffering with responsibility. They make us think that if we feel bad enough, maybe that means we're good. And that is exactly the point where things get weird. Because someone does not have to openly control you if they can make you feel guilty for wanting freedom. Someone does not have to forbid your desire if they can make you ashamed of having it. Someone does not have to punish you if they can teach you to punish yourself first. And that's why I want to talk about guilt and shame as forms of inner policing. And I'm not trying to say society shames us, which is true, of course, but it's also just kind of too easy, and it has an impact on our psyche that I find not useful. I'm more interested in kind of the creepy part, the moment where the outside voice becomes your voice. So the moment where the cop or the priest or the disappointed parent or the teacher or the mean girl or the algorithm or the ex or whatever, the comment section, they kind of move into your head and start a Telegram group chat. And in this group chat, you seem to be the only person that's muted. And I would say that Freud is very useful in this context, which obviously is going to upset people, but I really don't care. Freud is my OG. I love Freud. Back off if you don't like it. Okay, here we go. So Freud is very useful in this context because he gives us the superego, that kind of internal authority that watches and judges and accuses and punishes. So the superego is not always the wise voice of conscience, right? Sometimes it's just old punishment wearing your face. Like sometimes it's not saying like repair what you damaged. It actually says suffer, shrink, confess, disappear, prove that you are good by hurting yourself. It really does this. And then shame comes with its own kind of special flavor, right? Guilt says you did something wrong. And then shame says you are wrong. So shame is not just feeling bad, shame is feeling exposed. It's the feeling that everyone can suddenly see the embarrassing little truth of you, your neediness, your desire, your awkwardness, your hunger to be loved, your failed attempt to seem casual, your terrible little human wish to be seen and not immediately destroyed. Which is why I think Cringe is the perfect place to start this episode. Because cringe is shame as entertainment. It's what happens when someone's desire becomes visible and everyone else goes, oh no, don't do that. Don't want that. Don't want that openly. Don't try that hard. Don't be that sincere. Don't be that human in public. And of course we laugh because it's funny, but we also laugh because we're terrified. Because deep down we know I have also wanted too much. I have also tried too hard. I have also sent the message. I have also posted something stupid. So this episode is going to ask the following questions. What if guilt and shame are not sacred truths? What if they are not always signs of morality? What if sometimes they're just old authorities speaking through us? What happens when we stop treating guilt and shame as verdicts and start treating them as material, right? Something that we can examine, something that we can question, something that we can laugh at sometimes, something to use even if it's useful, something to throw away if it's not useful. Because the point is not to become innocent. The point is not to never be shameful or feel shame or something. The point is not to be shameless in like the shallow sense, right? The point is OWNNESS. The point is to ask, do I have this guilt or does this guilt have me? Do I have this shame or does this shame have me? And if shame has become a little god that exists inside of me, what would it mean to desecrate this? And because we're starting with cringe, guilt, shame, and all the beautiful little ways the human soul tries to leave the body, I also want to invite you to send something in for the next print issue of The Creative Nothing. Yes, this is an advertisement. All right, so what I want to do is I'm really interested in this. Ever since I've been working on this episode, I've really been interested in this whole shame, cringe, guilt mechanism, right? So what I want to do is I want to encourage you here to send something into our ZINE. It's always published in around February of each year. So the second issue will come out in February 2027. We're currently working on putting it all together. All right, so the question that I want to ask as this kind of writing prompt is, what is the most cringe feeling that you have ever had? And I'm not asking like the most cringe thing that you've ever done. What I want you to think about is the most cringe feeling that you've ever had, okay? So I'm not saying the thing, I'm saying the feeling. So that moment where you felt exposed, where you wanted to crawl out of your body, where you were suddenly aware of yourself as a person with hands and a face and a voice and needs and a desire and body and history and unfortunately a memory, you know? What is the most cringe you've ever felt? So what we're doing is we're collecting these for publication in the upcoming issue. So send us your cringe feelings. Send a confession, a story, a fragment, a rant, a poem, a dramatic little paragraph, whatever form makes sense. It can be funny, it can be painful, it can be stupid, it can be profound. It's up to you. Like I said, the format is open. I'm just very interested in thinking about cringe because I think there's something really deep about it. All right. This was a very long introduction. I am sorry. But let's get into the first part of this episode. Spook of the week. Let's start with cringe. All right, cringe. What is cringe? I would say cringe is the most democratic form of shame. And what I mean by that is no matter how cool or radical or self-aware or aesthetically coherent or emotionally attached or politically correct or spiritually involved or clinically diagnosed you are, somewhere inside you, there is a moment that you cannot think about without making at least an internal scream noise, okay? And that noise is philosophy. Cringe is funny because it's so stupidly specific. It's never just, I feel bad. It's always, I remembered the way I waved at someone who was not waving at me. I remembered the text I sent at 2:13 in the morning where I used the phrase no worries either way, even though there were in fact many worries in every direction. Like, cringe is not elegant. Cringe is sweaty, right? Cringe has screenshots, it has timestamps, it has outfits. And the worst thing about cringe is that it does not respect time. Shame is the only thing that can travel through time with perfect accuracy. You can be lying in bed, completely innocent, trying to sleep, and suddenly your brain is like, do you remember that shit you said in 2017? And your body responds to that, right? It responds as if you're currently in danger. It's not just like, oh my God, that was so embarrassing. Okay, I'm going to go to sleep now. No, your nervous system acts like a fucking lion has just entered the room wearing the face of your past. That's one reason cringe is so interesting. I think that it kind of shows that shame is not just about the present. Shame is like memory with shark teeth, you know? It's the past becoming active again. It's the feeling that some version of you is still on trial somewhere. And this is why cringe is such a good doorway, I think, into guilt and shame. And it's the kind of cultural manifestation of those mechanisms inside of us. Because cringe feels silly at first. It seems like a silly thing. It seems light, you know? It seems like internet culture. It seems like memes, bad dancing, old YouTube videos, theater kids, LinkedIn posts, Disney adults, whatever. And yeah, I mean, that shit's funny. It can be funny. But underneath, cringe is something a lot darker, I think. Like, cringe is the fear of being exposed as wanting. And that's the real horror, you know? The person who's cringe usually wants something. They want something deeply, and they want it too visibly. They want to be loved. They want to be admired. They want to be funny. They want to be sexy. They want to be deep. They want to be seen as interesting. They want to belong. They want to be forgiven or be cool or be original or desired. They want to be, oftentimes I would say they want to be recognized as something that maybe they are not representing in the best way. And the audience reacts with disgust because that desire has failed to disguise itself. And that's what cringe is. So cringe is desire for getting to look casual. And that's terrifying because so much of social life is built around pretending not to want what we obviously do want. So you're supposed to want love, but not too desperately. You're supposed to want attention, but not too obviously. You're supposed to want success, but not in a way that makes other people feel the effort. You're supposed to want sex, but not in the way that it looks desperate, needy. You're supposed to want friendships, but not in a way that reveals your loneliness. You're supposed to want recognition, but you have to pretend it just happened naturally because you were being authentic in an effortless, marketable, socially acceptable fucking way. You are allowed to want, but only if the wanting is well lit, ironic, plausible, and deniable. So cringe happens when wanting loses plausible deniability. And that is why cringe is not just comedy, it is actually policing. When we call something cringe, we're not just saying that's awkward. We're saying you showed too much. You wanted too openly. This was too real. You failed to perform the correct distance from your own desire. And then, of course, we internalize that. We learn to pre-cringe at ourselves. So before we post, we imagine the judgment that's going to happen. And before we speak, we imagine the reaction and so forth. We imagine someone else saying, wow, you really care about this? And that sentence, and this sounds harsh or ridiculous, but that sentence can destroy a person. Like truly destroy them internally. It can make them shut down because it doesn't argue with you. It doesn't say you're wrong. It just frames your sincerity as exposure. It says, ha ha, caught you caring, motherfucker. Caught you wanting. Caught you believing this mattered. Caught you being a person. And the shame lands because secretly we often agree with this accusation. We think wanting makes us vulnerable. We think needing makes us ugly. We think sincerity makes us available for punishment. And this is why irony became such a survival strategy. Like think about all like the massive boom in meme culture since like 2006 or 7 or whatever. Because it's if everything is ironic, then nothing can humiliate you. If everything is a bit, then no one can prove that you meant it, right? It's like a safe way of showing something. If you are always joking, you're never exposed. And I understand that. I love a bit. I respect the bit. The bit has carried many of us through situations where sincerity would have killed us instantly. But the problem is that shame can make irony into a hiding place. And I think this is happening in society. So you start joking before anyone can see that you care. You start mocking your own desire before anyone else can. And maybe that works for a while, but it also means the shame mechanism has already won. Because now you don't need anyone else to humiliate you. You kind of arrive in a pre-humiliated state. You become your own comment section. And honestly, that is rude. Okay? I did not consent to having a comment section inside of my fucking head. I did not agree to this. There was no checkbox. I would like to unsubscribe from the inner forum of imaginary people who are disappointed in me because fuck them. Okay? But that's the thing about shame. It doesn't ask permission. It just enters through the gaze. Someone looks at you in a certain way, or you imagine them looking at you in a certain way, and suddenly you see yourself from the outside. So you're no longer like experiencing yourself, you're watching yourself being watched. And that's the structure of shame. I'm not just here, I'm here as seen and judged and exposed. And once you experience that enough, then you can learn to kind of carry this gaze with you. You don't need the actual audience anymore. You bring the audience into the room. You bring them into your bedroom and your shower and your drafts folder and your memories and your body, your desire. And it makes you like the watched and the watcher. And that's where cringe leads us into the real topic of this episode, because cringe is public shame, right? But shame doesn't stay public. It becomes internal. It becomes a reflex. It becomes a tiny wince before you even act. So you start editing yourself before anyone has spoken, that type of stuff. And this is why I want to bring up Cathy O'Neill's book, The Shame Machine, in this segment, because she is interested in how shame gets used. So we're not just talking about feelings, we're talking about usefulness. So shame can be activated, it can be intensified, it can be organized, it can be monetized, and it can be turned into an instrument. And this matters especially on a cultural level, because shame often presents itself as deeply personal. When we are ashamed, we feel alone. We feel uniquely defective. We feel as if shame is proof that there's something wrong with us specifically. But O'Neill's point is useful because it reminds us that shame is not just an intimate feeling. It can be produced, it can be targeted, and it can be made profitable. So it can be engineered. And again, I don't want to turn this episode into some kind of a broad critique of every social institution. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm interested in the mechanism. So the mechanism is this. Find a place where someone feels exposed. Find the thing they already fear is wrong with them. Find the desire they are ashamed of. Find the image they are failing to live up to. And then press there. That is how shame works. And once you understand that, you kind of start seeing it everywhere around you. I'm not saying everything is the same, but you can see it because the mechanism repeats. So say a beauty ad. A beauty ad doesn't need to say you're disgusting, right? It never says on a beauty ad, you are disgusting if you don't look like this. It only needs to suggest that everyone else has noticed something that you failed to fix, right? So like this person's pores are not visible, okay? Meaning everyone knows that pores that are slightly more opened than this person's are disgusting. Hence, you are disgusting. A productivity influencer does not need to say you are worthless. They only need to imply that your exhaustion is a character flaw. A political group is also another good example. Political groups, they don't need to say you're evil. They only need to kind of make you feel afraid that one wrong sentence is going to reveal your impurity and then you're going to be ostracized. A family member does not need to say, you belong to me, right? They only need to say, after everything I've done for you, this is how you treat me, you know? So you have to see the covert, implicit manipulation that is going on everywhere and imprints itself in your head. So this is the key point. Shame and guilt are powerful because they make control feel internal. So if someone forces you, you know there's conflict. But if someone can make you feel guilty, the conflict starts to feel like it's inside of you. You're no longer just saying that, like, they want something from me. You're saying, maybe I am bad for not giving it. And that's an entirely different level of control. Because now the demand is not just external. Now it has a moral atmosphere. At this point, saying no does not mean no anymore. It means betrayal, selfishness, cruelty, ungratefulness, failure, abandonment. And guilt is so good at this. Guilt turns someone else's expectation into your debt. That's why guilt tripping works. The demand could be something simple like, do what I want, stay where I need you, be who I can tolerate, do not disappoint me, do not leave, do not change, do not want too much, do not become unavailable to my version of you. But instead of saying that directly, guilt speaks in little sacred fucking phrases. It says, I guess I'm just a terrible person then. I thought you cared. After all I did for you, this is how you treat me? You've changed. I just never expected this from you. And my personal favorite, the fucking crown jewel of emotional manipulation is do whatever you want. Which, of course, means do whatever you want, but understand that I will now make the room emotionally fucking haunted. Guilt is incredibly efficient because it does not always forbid. Sometimes it only charges interest. So you can do the thing, you can say no, you can leave, you can rest, you can choose yourself, you can want something, but you will fucking pay for it. You'll pay by feeling selfish. This is why Nietzsche's connection between guilt and debt is so useful, even if Freud is going to be our main guide today. Because guilt often feels like owing. Like you owe an apology, you owe an explanation, right? You owe your future self-optimization version and whatever. And shame goes even further. Shame says the debt is you. You are what has not been paid off. You are the problem still standing there. That's why shame feels so absolute, so total. Guilt can sometimes point to an action, but shame attacks your existence. Guilt says you did something wrong, and shame says, why the fuck are you like this? And why are you like this is one of the most devastating sentences in the English language, in my opinion, because it doesn't ask for explanation. It literally asks you to disappear. It says your whole being has entered the room incorrectly. You should not be here. And that's why shame is so deeply tied to the body. So we're ashamed of the body because the body is impossible to fully hide from. Like, it gives us away. It blushes, it sweats, it shakes, it wants, it ages, it gets hungry, it gets sick. It has needs at inconvenient times. It's not optimized. It refuses the branding guidelines. The body is very cringe. The body is constantly doing things without checking if they are aesthetically coherent. And shame hates that. Shame wants a controlled body, a composed body, a body that never reveals too much, never needs too much, never desires too openly, never breaks down, never smells, never fails, never becomes inconvenient, never takes up too much space. But human beings are fucking inconvenient by nature. That is, unfortunately, one of our main features as people. We need, we want, we attach, we misread signals, we try, we fail, we get excited, we get rejected, we get jealous, we get lonely. We perform confidence while internally buffering, you know? And then what do we do with that? We fucking call it cringe. So maybe cringe is not the enemy. Maybe cringe is a place where the truth leaks out. A person trying too hard is also a person who has not fully hidden the fact that they want to be loved, right? A person being too sincere is also a person who has not fully surrendered to the demand to be detached. A person posting weird shit, cringe things, right, is risking exposure. And exposure is dangerous to our minds. But I have to say, exposure is also where life is. And this is where shame is such a horrifying and strong spook, because shame doesn't actually protect us from humiliation. It protects us from the life before humiliation. It's like saying, don't risk this desire. Don't send the message. Don't make the art. Don't ask for anything. Don't say that. Don't be ridiculous. And listen, I understand that. I'm not going to pretend that exposure is like beautiful. It's really not. Sometimes exposure is horrible, right? Sometimes exposure is cruel, and I don't know, like a comment section maybe should be considered a public health hazard at times. Sometimes being seen by the wrong people doesn't liberate you. It just gives them ammunition. Like, I'm aware of that. I'm aware of the danger of like the collective. So I'm not saying be vulnerable with everybody. That would be stupid. Some people don't deserve access to you, to your sincerity. Some people should receive only, the administrative language that you have to offer. But I am saying that shame can make us confuse protection with disappearance. It can make us think the only safe self is the hidden self, the corrected self, the self with no visible needs, the self with no embarrassing desires, the self that never asks too much, that never wants too much, that never takes up too much space. And that self is safe, but it's also barely alive. And that's why cringe matters for a Stirnerian critique of shame, because the fear of cringe is often the fear of ownness becoming visible before it has been approved, right? So ownness is definitely not always dignified, right? It can be strange, it can be awkward, it can be unattractive to the wrong audience. It can look like leaving a role people really liked you in, you know? Like, ownness can look like making art that fucking sucks, you know? Ownness can be really, really cringe. And that is maybe why shame attacks it so quickly, because shame's job is to bring you back under the gaze. It says, what will they think? But what ownness asks is, why are they the measure? Shame says, you're exposed. But ownness asks, exposed to whom? To what? And that kind of questioning, the questions that ownness asks, that's what I want for this episode. Not like becoming invulnerable or shameless in the sense of having no social awareness. Please, oh my God, please don't do that. I do not want to deal with that fucking shit when I'm walking around taking public transportation. Okay. No, that's not what I want. The goal is basically like to become able to tell the difference between a feeling that is giving you information and a feeling that's demanding worship. That's all it is. Nothing more than that. Because I think that shame loves to act like it's truth, right? It arrives with the force of some kind of fucking revelation. But I think shame is not revelation at all. I think shame is literally just interpretation. Shame is a story told from the viewpoint of judgment. Shame has nothing to do with truth. It's just the effect of seeing yourself through an authority that you probably didn't choose. And guilt is very similar. It says you're responsible. But I think it means simply that you have disobeyed an expectation. And I think that's a more useful way of looking at it. Like, sometimes guilt means you have disappointed someone who benefited from your compliance, or it means you're about to desire something that threatens an old arrangement that you've had, or you're leaving the role, or you're no longer available for the version of you that kept everyone else comfortable. And that's why we need to slow it down. Like, the feeling arrives very quickly, right? Shame is fast, guilt is fast, cringe is instant. But ownness, it requires a pause. And it requires a disrespectful pause. It requires a moment where you kind of say, okay, feeling, I hear you. But before I reorganize my entire life around you, I have some fucking questions. You know, who taught me this accusation? What desire are you trying to stop? What authority are you protecting? Is there something to repair here, or do you just want me to suffer? Because that is the difference. If I hurt someone, I can repair. But if shame only wants me to disappear, then shame has nothing to do with ethics. It's just a fucking executioner without a trial. And I'm not obligated to hand this motherfucker the axe to fucking kill me with. So yeah, I think cringe can be funny, but I don't think you should laugh at it. I think you should ask why it hurts so much. Why some tiny awkward moment still has so much power over you, you know? And then maybe the best question to ask would be, which part of you has been exposed here? Like, which desire appeared? Who do you imagine as watching you? And why is it important? Because cringe is not just a humiliation. It could be a clue to the places where shame has been guarding something, you know? Like, it's possible that shame is guarding a version of you that wanted something. And maybe the task is not to purify that version of yourself, but rather to like retrieve that and figure it out, understand it. So that's the spook of the week. Cringe, public shame, right? Exposed desire. the little social death that teaches us to hide before we kind of have even lived. And now what I want to do is I want to turn to Freud with all of this information, all of this thought. And I want to think about the superego and the inner court where guilt stops being a feeling and becomes a law. All right, let's get to the kind of philosophical anatomy of guilt and shame. So again, the spook today is not just guilt, right? It's not just shame. And it's not just like the interplay of them both. It's more like the spook that I'm looking at, really what it is, it's the moment that guilt and shame become an authority. So like when guilt is telling you that you have to suffer, you deserve to suffer. And when shame is telling you that this exposure is like revealing what you actually are, what you truly are. This is your truth, and you should disappear for it. What I'm saying really is a feeling can be real without being sovereign. And that's kind of what we need to look at here. So like guilt can contain information. It can reveal something, or shame can reveal a vulnerability. But neither feeling automatically possesses the authority to judge your entire existence. And I think to understand how they work, we have to understand how they acquire the authority, right, to be this judge in our existence. So I think the best way to think about this is to look at several different philosophical accounts of like the mechanism of guilt, like what it is. We're going to look at Nietzsche's genealogy of debt, Freud's theory of the superego, Sartre's analysis of the gaze, Foucault's account of surveillance, and Stirner's critique of the sacred ultimately. And I think that by doing that, they kind of allow us to see guilt and shame as more than moral truths, but as mechanisms. All right, I think the best place to start here is Nietzsche. So Nietzsche begins by asking where like our moral concepts came from. So he doesn't assume that guilt emerged because human beings sort of gradually discovered an eternal moral truth. He's very much against that. On the genealogy of morality, he actually traces guilt back to the material relationship between creditor and debtor. So this is especially visible in, I think, the German word Schuld, which means both guilt and debt. So the earliest structure is not I have sinned. The earliest structure is I owe. So like someone has made a promise, like an obligation has been created of some sort, or like an account has to be settled. So when the debtor cannot repay, then the creditor gains the right to punish. So pain kind of becomes a form of compensation. The suffering of the debtor symbolically balances the unpaid account. Nietzsche's genealogy that he kind of evokes here connects guilt to calculation, obligation, punishment, and the pleasure of exercising power over someone who owes. And over time, this concrete debt becomes moralized. So we don't just owe money at that point, or labor or property or whatever. We start to owe obedience and gratitude and purity and self-denial. So the debt is pushed inward until the person experiences themselves as kind of permanently indebted. And some debts are constructed so that they can never be repaid. So you owe your parents, right? You owe your parents because they raised you. You owe your partner because they love you, they chose you. You owe society because it allowed you to exist within it. You owe God because your entire existence was given to you. So then this kind of debt, this debt is infinite. Nietzsche describes this as the impossibility of paying the debt. So this, I think, kind of helps explain why guilt so often demands suffering rather than repair. If guilt retains the structure of debt, then pain looks like payment. So the logic is, I hurt someone, therefore I have to hurt. I made a mistake, therefore I lose the right to peace. If I hate myself enough, then maybe I can prove that I understand. If I stay guilty forever, then maybe I can demonstrate that the harm mattered. But the problem is that suffering doesn't necessarily repair anything. It probably won't restore what was lost. It probably won't help the person who was harmed. This is also important. It probably won't prevent the action from happening again. It just makes the debtor pay. So Nietzsche kind of gives us the first layer of this spook, right? Guilt is like a kind of internal economy in which suffering is treated as moral currency. And the important question isn't just, do I feel guilty? It's, what exactly do I owe? To whom? What would repayment mean? And is this a debt that can ever be discharged? Because when no repair is considered sufficient, then guilt is not responding to an event, right? It's a permanent condition of existence. Now, I think the next layer to this that we need to look at is superego. So let's talk about Freud. So Freud takes Nietzsche's bad conscience into the structure of the psyche. So in Civilization and its Discontents, which we're going to talk about later again, he argues that human aggression doesn't disappear when society prohibits its expression. All it does is it is directed inward. So a part of the ego kind of separates itself from the rest and becomes the superego. So the aggression that might once have been directed toward an external authority is now turned against the self. And Freud describes the superego as an internal institution that watches and judges both the ego's actions and its intentions. And I think this is so important. The superego doesn't judge what you do only. It judges what you want. It's capable of judging something that nobody else can judge. You may have correctly and still feel guilty because part of you has wanted something forbidden, right? Maybe you stayed but you wanted to leave. Maybe you helped, but really what you wanted was recognition. Okay, I think that's a really good example. The superego demands not just good behavior, but like purity of desire. And because human motives are never completely pure, it can always find evidence, like care, like it holds within its implications, it holds need. And something like love, right, can hold within it aggression. So like every action emerges from like a divided psyche, but the superego interprets this complexity as a kind of moral fraud. It says if you enjoyed helping, then maybe you only help to feel good about yourself. If you set a boundary, then maybe it was not self-preservation, but actually selfishness. Do you get what I'm saying? Like if you apologize, maybe you were just managing the other person's perception of you. It always has this like internal doubt. There is no answer that can satisfy it because the superego is not a reasonable ethical guide. It's authority infused with aggression. So Freud writes that civilization establishes this authority inside the individual. And this is a quote, like a garrison in a conquered city. And what this is doing is it's providing an image, right? The garrison is not identical with the city. It occupies the city. So the voice can come from inside you, but that doesn't mean that it expresses your own considered judgment. Like it's probably more likely composed of like parental demands, religious demands, prohibitions, threats of abandonment, fear of punishment, and I don't know, like conditions for love or something. And this is why guilt can happen before you have done anything. Like, you feel guilty for wanting to say no, like for wanting to leave, for being angry, for resting, for experiencing relief, for needing attention, all those things. That guilt does not necessarily indicate that harm has occurred. It actually most of the time indicates that an internalized authority has detected disobedience. So you approach freedom, right? And as soon as you get close to it, there's an alarm that happens. And because the alarm is inside you, you assume that freedom itself has to be wrong. So Freud gives us like the second layer to the spook. Guilt is aggression that is transformed into conscience, while the superego is the external authority that has learned to speak in the first person. And this is why self-cruelty can actually appear so virtuous to us. Like, a person would never speak to a friend as violently as they speak to themselves. But because the cruelty is directed inward, they call it humility and accountability and like seriousness or whatever. But responsibility and self-punishment are not the same thing. And the difference is that responsibility will ask questions like what happened, who was harmed, and what has to change. But self-punishment is a selfish thing. It says, suffer, and you will maybe become clean. You know the difference? Like, do you understand the difference? One kind of moves toward reality, and the other stays inside of the courtroom, and it wants to stay there. Now, I think a good way to look at the third layer, which is shame and the gaze, I want to use Sartre. So Nietzsche explains the debt and Freud explains the judge, but what Sartre does is he explains the audience. So in Being and Nothingness, he describes shame through the experience of being seen by another person. There's a famous example that he uses of someone who's looking through a keyhole. So at first the person is absorbed in the act, right? They are not observing themselves. They're simply looking. And then they hear footsteps, right? And then suddenly they become aware of themselves as someone who can be seen. So they're no longer only a subject looking at the world. They become an object within another person's world. And Sartre writes this: I recognize that I am as the other sees me. This is the structure of shame. Literally, this is the structure of shame. Shame is not disliking yourself. It's experiencing yourself from an imagined external position. So I see myself as needy through your imagined impatience. I see myself as ugly through your imagined disgust. I see myself as foolish through your imagined superiority. So the gaze gives the other person an apparently privileged access to what I am. So their perspective begins to feel more truthful than my own existence. And this is why shame feels like some kind of a fucking revelation. So it's not like you think that someone has interpreted you negatively. You think that you've been exposed. So like this moment becomes your identity. Like you did something awkward and then you're like, oh, I'm such an awkward person. You know, like that's false. It's not true. Shame transforms the other person's perspective into an essence, but no gaze can actually contain you. Someone can say something real about you, right? But they don't actually see you. They can see an aspect of you. They can judge you, but they don't own the truth of you. Exposure is not the same as revelation, but to our minds, it feels like it is. So what Sartre is doing here, he's giving us the third layer, okay? So if we use Sartre, we can have the third layer of the spook. Shame is the experience of becoming an object beneath another person's gaze. And the deepest danger appears when we internalize that gaze so thoroughly that the other person no longer needs to be present. Now, I want to get to the fourth layer of the spook. And to do that, I want to work with Foucault. So Foucault's analysis of the panopticon is super important in order to understand shame and how that mechanism is embedded in the social structure. So the panopticon is a prison designed around a central observation tower. So the prisoner can be seen, but can't know exactly when someone is watching. So it's like there might be surveillance, so you kind of have to behave as if you're being watched. So the guard doesn't actually need to be there or like intervene continuously. The prisoner just simply starts supervising themselves. And Foucault summarizes the principle with this one sentence. He says, visibility is a trap. And shame works the same way. You don't need an audience. You only need the possibility of an audience. So for example, let's say you remember something embarrassing while you're alone in bed. No one involved is thinking about it. Most likely, you're the only person even remembering that moment. But this internal tower is still there. You anticipate criticism before anyone speaks. You minimize your needs before anyone calls you needy. You can suppress enthusiasm because you're worried about somebody possibly laughing about it. And this is way more effective, and this is something that Foucault talks about, this is way more effective than direct control. An external authority can't follow you everywhere. It's not possible. But once the gaze has been internalized, you carry it with you. You become the person living and the person watching the life. Foucault says the subjected person eventually becomes the principle of his own subjection. Those are his words. And this is the point at which shame becomes politically useful. So a person who constantly monitors themselves requires less open coercion. Like, you can technically say no. You can technically leave. You can technically express a desire. No one is physically preventing you. You're simply required to survive the shame afterward. So thank you, Foucault, for giving us the fourth layer. Power becomes most effective when the observed person takes over the work of observation. So the outer police becomes the inner police. Now, most important part, fifth layer, let's look at Max Stirner and the idea of desecrating guilt. So Stirner gives us a way of thinking about resistance that is incredibly unique. His critique is directed toward the sacred. So ideas, values, and ideals that have been separated from the individual and placed above them. So a sacred idea is not in this context is not just something that we care about, right? It's something we're no longer permitted to question or use or transform into whatever we want. It does not belong to us. We belong to it. And this is such an incredibly useful way of looking at it. Stirner writes in his text, "What is sacred to me is not my own." Guilt becomes sacred when its authority can't be questioned. Shame becomes sacred when it's treated as the final truth of the self, when it's tied to existence. Conscience becomes sacred when every internal accusation is assumed to be morally legitimate. And at that point, the feeling is no longer something that I experience. It is something that I have to bow down to. So what Stirner does is he does not eliminate guilt and shame, right? What he does is he takes them back from the sacred space to make them your property. And what that means is being able to say the guilt is present. It's here. It exists. There's something that happened. I fucked up. But now I have to ask, what is it? What is the guilt? What produced it? What does it demand? Does it point toward actual harm? Does it offer useful knowledge? Can it guide repair? which should be the goal of guilt? Or is it just an old authority trying to restore its power over me? So kind of like the central question is, do I have guilt or does guilt have me? If guilt is mine, I can use it, right? I can do something with it. I can be accountable. I can change something. I can repair. I can allow it to direct my attention toward the thing that I have harmed. But if guilt possesses me, then no repair is ever going to be enough, because it demands your suffering, because suffering confirms its own authority. And the same is true for shame. If shame belongs to me, I can examine the vulnerability inside of me that it reveals. If shame owns me, then it defines what I am and tells me to fuck off. It tells me to disappear. OWNNESS doesn't mean refusing responsibility. It means refusing to turn responsibility into a sacred abstraction that demands self-annihilation. So I can care about a person because they matter to me. I can repair harm because I want a relationship with that person. It matters to me. I can change because the consequences of my actions have become real to me. But I don't need to worship guilt in order to give a fuck. And I don't need to destroy myself to prove that another person's suffering matters. So Stirner gives us the fifth and final layer, which is the task is not innocence, it's ownership. So put together, I think like from I like to do like little diagrams of shit, and this is the diagram that came up in my head. I think that what this reveals is a kind of sequence. So Nietzsche shows how obligation becomes debt and debt becomes guilt. Freud shows how punishment and authority become internalized. Sartre shows how shame kind of turns us toward the gaze of another. And Foucault shows that gaze becomes self-surveillance. And then Stirner asks why these internal authorities have been made sacred. So the mechanism kind of looks like this. Debt becomes guilt, authority becomes conscience, the gaze becomes surveillance, surveillance becomes self-punishment, and self-punishment becomes obedience. And I think unspooking in this context starts in a way of separating responsibility from the machine. Like, when guilt appears, then when the question is, how do I make it stop immediately, then you already know something is fucking weird, you know? Like, the questions that should come up in your head first should be, what happened? Was someone harmed? What was my part? What repair is possible? What change is needed? And after the repair, what does the remaining guilt demand of me? Does it want understanding? Does it want punishment? Does it want changed behavior or permanent contamination? Because those are very different things. And when shame appears, then the question should be like, who is it that I'm looking at? Who's looking at me? Whose gaze have I internalized? What image of myself has collapsed? Why does this moment appear to define everything that I am? And I think when we ask those questions, it creates a distance between the feeling and the command. And that distance is not, contrary to what anyone will ever tell you in any kind of like morally virtuous spaces, this is not the denial of responsibility. It's the condition for genuine responsibility. Because the person who's consumed by proving that they're good, they will not confront what actually happened. And the person who's declared themselves irredeemably bad is not going to believe that change is actually possible. These are both extremely narcissistic and self-serving actions that people engage in, or coping strategies that people engage in order to cope with what has happened. These are escapes. Because the harder position is to say, I did this shit and it had these consequences, and I am not purified by suffering or reduced to action forever. Like, I can take responsibility without turning punishment into a sacred ideal. That's the point at which guilt loses its validity. Like, the inner court becomes something that we can examine rather than obey. The question is not whether guilt and shame will appear. They will. The question is whether they become rulers, whether we can feel guilt without becoming debtors forever, whether we can experience shame without accepting the gaze as truth. All right, now let's get into the practical aspects of this. You know, it's because the truth is it's all easier said than done, right? Like, these are some of the most difficult and extreme feelings that we can have. So dealing with them is so incredibly difficult. Most of the time they have all these mechanisms tied to them. So let's get into practical things that we can actually do to kind of move from inner punishment to an analytical distance, because that's really the move that's necessary. And for that, I want to ask, if guilt and shame can become an internal court system, then how do we interrupt them without pretending that we can simply stop feeling them? Because the goal is not innocence, right? It's not complete shamelessness. And it's also definitely not becoming someone who never apologizes because they've watched 3 videos that I made about egoism. It's ridiculous. The goal is to create a distance between the feeling and the command. And this is where we need to think in a more psychoanalytic way. So psychoanalysis does not start by asking whether a feeling is valid or invalid, right? It asks what psychic work the feeling is performing. So like, what does this guilt protect? What does the shame conceal? What conflict does it organize? And whose authority does it reproduce? And also, I guess, like, what desire does it make impossible to acknowledge? So I would say that living ownness starts with like just simply a moment of pause, like an analytic pause. And the logic behind that is, before I start obeying this feeling, first I want to take a minute to think about what it's doing. So what is the actual accusation? Let's start there. So shame speaks in totalities, right? Like, I'm disgusting, I'm selfish, I'm ugly, I'm fat, I'm a bad person, I'm weak, blah, 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 blah. Psychoanalytic attention kind of takes that accusation and it forces it to become way more specific. What I tend to do is I kind of tend to imagine this as another person who's accusing me of something. So I want to stand in front of this person and I want to say, okay, what did I actually do? Did I harm someone? Did I break an agreement? Did I betray a commitment? Or is it just that I disappointed someone, or revealed a need, or failed to perform a role, or became visible in a way that frightened me? And this distinction is very important. It's so important to figure that out, because an action can be examined, but an identity verdict can't. So like, I lied gives us something to work with, right? But I'm fundamentally bad. It's closing something. And every time something is closed in thought, you have to question it. Shame converts an event into an essence. So the first act of ownness, I think, would therefore be to reverse that conversion. Meaning, we're going back from what does this prove that I am to what actually happened. And that does not minimize responsibility. It just makes it actually, what it actually does is it makes responsibility possible. So like, if I have done harm, right, then I need to know what the harm was in order to fix it. If I have broken an agreement, then I need to identify the agreement before I can actually do something with that. But if I have violated an inherent expectation, then the expectation itself needs to be examined. So there's a difference there. Don't immediately defend yourself. Don't immediately condemn yourself. Interrogate it first. There's nothing wrong with that. So, Freud argues that guilt first develops through dependence on external authority. So the child fears punishment, but more fundamentally, the child fears the withdrawal of love. So what's called bad is actually initially whatever threatens the attachment on which the child depends. And then later, this authority is internalized as the superego. So the external judge no longer has to be present because a part of the psyche has taken over the work of watching and judging and punishing. Freud describes this internal authority as a garrison installed in a conquered city. So aggression is turned back against the ego, and the tension between the ego and the superego is experienced as guilt and a need for punishment. And this gives us a very precise question, which is this my considered ethical judgment, or is this the fear of losing love speaking as morality? So sometimes the answer is very obvious, right? Like the voice sounds exactly like a parent or a partner or a teacher or a religious authority or a political authority, whatever. At other times, though, it's only the structure that remains. So if I say no, I will be abandoned. If I become angry, I will become unlovable. The person is gone, but the condition is still there. So like you may be loved, but only as long as you remain this version of yourself. And this is why guilt often appears before any harmful action has actually occurred. So the superego can judge intentions and fantasies as severely as actions because nothing can be hidden from an internal authority. So you can feel guilty for wanting to leave before you leave. The feeling does not necessarily mean that you have done wrong. It actually may mean that a forbidden wish has become conscious. And this is where guilt and shame also become especially important psychoanalytically. Now, the next question is, what desire is being defended against, right, in this mechanism? This is where guilt and shame are so important psychoanalytically because they don't just respond to actions, they regulate desire. So shame appears when a desire becomes visible. Like, I wanted to be chosen, I wanted to leave, I wanted attention, whatever. The point is not that every desire should be acted upon. Like, psychoanalysis doesn't turn desire into like a moral authority. Desires conflict with each other. They can be destructive, right, and contradictory and impossible or directed toward people who should absolutely not receive a message from us at 2 a.m, okay? The first task is not obedience to desire. The first task is just simply recognition. Like, can I admit what I want without immediately transforming the wish into evidence that I am bad? And this is where I like to think about Lacan. Because Lacan's formulation is basically that analytically, guilt appears when someone has given ground relative to one's desire. And this doesn't mean that like every guilty person has failed to follow a secret authentic desire or something. Like, desire is not a pure inner truth ever, okay? It just means that guilt can arise when we surrender our relation to desire in order to satisfy an internal demand. So we say yes when we want to say no, for example. And the result of this is not peace. The rejected desire returns indirectly as resentment or anxiety or inhibition or compulsive behavior or numbness or guilt or whatever. So the analytical question is, what did I have to stop knowing about myself in order to obey? I guess the way that I like to look at it is that ownness begins before action. Like, it begins when you're able to say, this desire exists. It's mine as an experience. So I may act on it, or I may transform it, or refuse it, or accept that it can't be fulfilled. Whatever is done with it is mine. But I'm not going to make it some unspeakable thing just because it disrupts the image of who I am supposed to be. I hope what I'm saying makes sense. So the next question should be something like, is this repair or is it just punishment? The most important practical distinction, I would say, is between responsibility and the need for punishment. Like, it's very important that we try to think about this after it happens. Like, after the thought occurs, it's very important that we think about this. Because if guilt points toward repair, then repair. Like, listen to the person, what are they going through? Who was harmed? Acknowledge what happened, change the behavior. But then if your guilt is pointing you toward punishment, right? If you start thinking, oh, I have to hate myself. How long do I have to hate myself? It feels so bad to hate myself right now. Psychoanalytically, this question reveals the superego's sadistic structure. Because the superego doesn't just want better conduct. It wants your submission, and it wants to punish you. And obedience doesn't satisfy that. Freud's very disturbing insight, it's that renunciation can make the superego way more severe. So the forbidden wish remains, and because it can't be hidden from the internal judge, then the person continues to feel guilty despite having obeyed. And this is why some shame spirals don't have a natural ending. Like, you can apologize, but the apology was selfish, so it doesn't work, it doesn't work internally. You can even improve, but you're just performing an improvement, so it doesn't work. You can forgive yourself, but that forgiveness proves that you didn't care, so it doesn't work. So the court can reinterpret everything that is happening as evidence, and it can use it against you. So what you should do is ask, what concrete action would constitute responsibility here? And has that action been taken? And what does continued suffering actually accomplish? And if the answer is nothing, if the guilt asks only that you remain contaminated by it, then it's not actually about repair. It's about maintaining an attachment to the fucking punishment. And I think the worst thing is that self-hatred is a mechanism that protects us from responsibility. If I become absorbed in the question of whether I'm a terrible person, right, then I don't have to stay with the more ordinary questions, which is what happened, what does the other person need, what patterns have to change, stuff like that. Self-punishment is dramatic. It's selfish, it's self-indulgent, it's drama. And repair is administrative. Now, what does living OWNNESS mean in this context? Okay, so OWNNESS doesn't mean suppressing guilt or proving that every accusation is socially constructed. That's the first thing. That's what it doesn't mean. What it does mean is refusing to grant authority to guilt. So a guilty feeling can enter the room, but it doesn't receive the the like deed to the house. Like it doesn't start becoming the owner of you. It has to be, and it can be questioned. So, what are you pointing toward? Are you connected to harm, to fear of abandonment, to an old prohibition, to a desire I don't want to acknowledge? Stuff like that. Is this about repair? Is this about punishment? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. Shame is connected to it in that it protects us through disappearance. If you don't speak, then you can't be mocked. If you don't ask, you can't be rejected. If you don't want, then you can't be humiliated. But this protection has a cost. It makes you safe from exposure by becoming less available to your own life. So living OWNNESS isn't about permanent exposure or something. Like I think a lot of people, if they thought of like practical strategies to implement this in their lives, I think they would think, okay, well, I just have to like be the main character in my own life and just say, fuck everybody. But that's not what egoism is about. It's not asking you to become cringe or something. Like, silence can be strategic and privacy can be useful. Not everyone deserves access to you. The distinction is whether I'm choosing privacy or being commanded to disappear. So OWNNESS it's not ever about the absence of inner conflict. It's the ability to participate in that conflict rather than being ruled by the harshest voice. So at this point, I want to respond to some comments that I got when I asked about like what was interesting to people about the concept, since it was like the number one chosen topic for the episode. And here's some stuff that I got. So one person described guilt and shame as like tools of self-censorship and denial of will and then negation of individuality. And I think this is obviously exactly right. But I want to add one psychoanalytic qualification. The will being censored is not necessarily like a simple, unified, authentic will. Like we contain conflicting wishes, right? But guilt and shame can make the conflict impossible to investigate because they prohibit one side from speaking. I'll read you what this person said exactly. As tools of self-censorship, denial of will, negation of individuality, all in the service of diminishing free expression. So I think that the superego does not like need to defeat a desire through argument. Like it can mark the desire as disgusting or selfish or unthinkable, and the person then kind of performs censorship on themselves. Like they don't just say like, I want this, but I've decided not to pursue it. That's not the way that anybody thinks. What we think is, I have to be the kind of person who could want this. And that is a way more profound form of repression because it attacks the person's capacity to recognize their own desire. I think unspooking therefore means allowing the wish to become thinkable in a way, rather than like automatically acting on the censored wish. So free expression begins internally with the freedom to know what one is trying not to know, if that makes sense. Another one that somebody commented was relating to moral objectification. So this commenter asked whether someone can unspook themselves after being morally essentialized, like after an action becomes a permanent social identity that the person then internalizes. So the comment, I'm going to quote it. I'm particularly interested in the first-person effects of moral objectification in the sense that once someone has transgressed society, that person often permanently gets branded as irreparably bad and then comes to internalize that message, even if they have evolved past their previous mistakes and are no longer that same kind of person. I'm curious if that state of feeling morally essentialized by others can be unspooked. And what I want to respond to that is that this is, I think, in my opinion, one of shame's most destructive operations. Like, say a person does something harmful, the action becomes a category, and then the category becomes an essence. And eventually the person kind of starts to experience themselves through that verdict. Like, I'm not someone who did something bad, I am the bad thing. And once that verdict has been internalized, then change, it's like it becomes irrelevant in a way. The person could even have already taken responsibility and developed and repaired what they could and become genuinely different, but the old identity is still frozen in a way. And I think psychoanalytically, the external accusation has been installed as an internal object in this case. So the person continues carrying the condemning gaze after the original observers are gone. And the question is now, can that be unspooked? I would say not by declaring the past unreal, and not by demanding that everyone like revise their judgment or something. Like, OWNNESS can't control the other person's gaze. But what it can do is it can refuse the claim that the gaze possesses the final truth of the self. So kind of the analytic move is to separate three things, right? What I did, what consequences remain, and what I am now because of it. And these are connected, but they're not identical. Responsibility requires like remembering continuity. Like, I can't pretend that the earlier version was a stranger. This happens a lot of the time. That was not me. A lot of people say that when they fucked up. Change requires recognizing difference. Like, I'm not condemned to repeat that earlier form forever. Permanent moral essentialization, I think, actually undermines responsibility because it makes transformation meaningless. So if a person is essentially bad, then there's nothing to understand and there's no reason to change. And I think unspooking in this context means retaining the history without turning it into destiny. Now, the next comment I got was, I just lost it. 1 second. Shame as the oxygen that fuels addiction. All right. So this is almost worthy of a whole video or a whole podcast episode. I did make a video about addiction, or at least like recovery and stuff like that, so it kind of touches on that. But I'm gonna try to just respond to it as much as I can, because this is like extremely precise. This is a very precise image, right? Addiction can like temporarily interrupt shame through intoxication, compulsion, absorption or numbness, I would say. But the behavior produces a kind of secrecy and like consequences, and then further shame. Like, everyone has heard of like the shame spiral, right? So the person kind of uses the substance or behavior to escape themselves. And then afterward, the superego attacks them for having escaped. And that attack produces more unbearable feeling. And then the cycle begins again. So shame therefore acts as both fuel and consequence. So it kind of says like, you're so disgusting, you're so disgusting, you're so disgusting, until you need relief. So then you seek relief, which again proves that you're fucking disgusting. So this is why humiliation is usually a poor cure for addiction. So what is still needed is accountability. Addiction harms people, and consequences can't just be translated into symptoms, right? But accountability without a distinction between the person and the symptom can produce the cycle. So the person needs to be able to say, this behavior is destructive. It belongs to my history and requires responsibility. But it's not the total truth of what I am. You know, it isn't. It's never the truth of what you are. And I think addicts of any kind, other than like socially acceptable addictions like fucking shopping and shit like that, they feel this idea that this is what they are. This is now what they are. So there needs to be, just like in any other case, there needs to be a pause, and there needs to be a kind of like interrogation of the judgment, right? Like, this is never the total truth of what you are. People change. People change constantly. People change in a second, in an instant, from whatever. Like, things change. And without that separation, without that understanding, recovery is probably impossible. Why stop if the verdict has already been delivered? You might as well submit to it. Now, another commenter said the following. Existential guilt is the experience one feels over refusing to emotionally live one's own life as a futile bargain with the loss of the inevitable, I think that's supposed to say. Is it an alarm bell ringing when one has given too much autonomy over to spooky influence, or indeed the state of being trapped by the spook of death and loss itself? Now, I'm gonna just answer this. I think it can be both. So there's a guilt that appears when we repeatedly abandon our own lives in exchange for security or approval, or like imagine protection from loss. And this resembles Lacan's idea of giving ground relative to desire. So the person has not necessarily violated a moral law. They've become alienated from what animates them in a way. So in that case, guilt may function as an alarm. Like, I'm not living the life that is mine to live. But there's also like a more tragic guilt that can't be solved by rejecting social authority. Like, to choose one life is to abandon others. To love one person means accepting that the relationship is finite. To act means closing possibilities. And death makes complete fulfillment impossible. So no act of unspooking can eliminate loss. So the task is not to defeat the finite as another spook. It's to stop using the inevitability of loss as a reason not to live. So existential guilt can therefore ask a useful question, which is, am I grieving the limits of life, or am I sacrificing my life in a futile attempt to avoid those limits? That's what I have to say about that. Now, the last comment says the following. Outside of morality or society's judgment, guilt can also come from the incoherent nature of being a person. People have all sorts of desires that either can't easily be fulfilled together, or it is outright impossible to fulfill. Choosing to do something, things closes doors to do other things. Choosing to do things closes doors to do other things, whether momentarily or permanently. And guilt can come from following one or a few desires while letting others go unfulfilled. And that's not going into how we all swim in an ocean of ghosts that connect with our desires and modify and create them, adding to the complexity. But I think it would be a mistake to think of guilt as strictly being about society. Also, guilt can be a useful tool for reflection and reevaluating one's shortcomings. But the question of shortcomings according to who or what is necessary to interrogate. But if guilt allows for someone to change, to be more clever, stronger, or whatever for the next time that desires are contradicting each other, and if that guilt isn't a tether, then I say it can be a useful thing. I wholeheartedly agree with this. And I think this is an essential correction. Not all guilt is imposed by society. The psyche is divided even without an identifiable moral authority. Like, we can want intimacy and independence. We can want stability and wildness, or adventure or chaos. We can want recognition and privacy. So like, no decision resolves every desire. A choice gives one possibility a life by refusing others. So some guilt is not a command to obey or evidence that we choose wrongly. It's the emotional remainder of choosing at all, basically. And this is where we need to distinguish punitive guilt from tragic guilt. So punitive guilt says you choose wrongly and you have to suffer now. And tragic guilt says something mattered and it couldn't be preserved alongside everything else that mattered. Does that make sense? Like the second form, it doesn't need to be eliminated. It can be part of mourning the paths that we didn't take and the people that couldn't be for everyone. And as this comment points out, guilt can be really useful when it supports reflection, right? Like, there's still a question, which is a shortcoming according to whom? Like, did guilt help me understand my conflicting desires more clearly? Did it make me more capable of acting differently next time? Or did it tether me permanently to a decision that can't be reversed? So there is useful guilt, and useful guilt becomes knowledge. But spooky guilt is like a sentence that turns into an essence. So, all right, let's summarize. Let's condense it. Living OWNNESS, I think, in context to guilt and shame, can be condensed to 4 questions. What happened? Meaning, separate the concrete action from the total judgment of the self. Who is speaking? So identify the authority, attachment, or threat of lost love inside the guilt. Then, what desire is being hidden? So finding the wish or the conflict or the loss that shame has made unspeakable. And then, is something being repaired or is it being punished? Meaning taking responsibility for what is real and refusing suffering that doesn't serve anyone. So the aim is not to become innocent. It's to become capable of responsibility without being possessed by it. To be able to say, this action is mine, this desire is mine, this conflict is mine, and this repair is mine. But the sacred verdict that I'm permanently disgusting, irredeemable, or unworthy of living, that's not mine. That's bullshit. I hear the accusation, but I am not its property. All right, now let's get into the last part. And I want to talk about one of the first books that got me into, I guess, the terrain, the realm of thought that I'm in, which is Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. All right, specifically, the parts that I want to talk about today are the parts, obviously, where he talks about guilt and conscience and superego and stuff. So I think that the title of this could be something like how the judge moves, like interrogating. Like, imagine you're a detective and you're driving around and you're following a judge and you're analyzing how the judge moves around and what his habits are. Because that, to me, is the most important thing that Freud gives us here. Freud says something so extremely disturbing, if you think about it. He says that guilt has to do with authority, outside authority, becoming internal. So like at first, the authority is outside of us, parent, community, teacher, God, whatever. And we perceive this person as someone who can punish us, whose love we need, whose approval means safety. So at first, guilt is connected to fear. If I do this one thing, then I'm going to be punished. If I do this one thing, then I'm going to lose access to love. And that's already powerful enough, obviously. But Freud says that this is not the end of it. Because eventually the authority doesn't stay outside, it becomes internal, it becomes the superego. And the superego is not just like a cute little conscience sitting on your shoulder, right? Not the way that it's portrayed in the media. The superego is much worse than that. It's much more disgustingly sadistic than that. It wants to censor you. It wants you to need it to censor you. It wants you to think that you need it. The inner authority watches you, judges you, accuses you, punishes you. The superego is what happens when authority doesn't have to stand in front of you because it's learned to speak from inside of you and it has way more information. This is so creepy, you know? This is Freud's horror story. You don't only feel guilty for what you did, you feel guilty for what you wished, for what you imagined, for what you wanted, for what you almost said, for what you swallowed, for the desire that you denied. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to go through some quotes. So Freud's central question is not like why people feel bad after doing something wrong. What he wants to do is he wants to understand how guilt becomes this internal mechanism. And like I said, I think this is incredibly important if you want to be able to apply the questions, like the pause that I explained in the Unspooking, in the Living OWNNESS segment as a form of unspooking. So this helps us kind of like understanding of whether or not something is intended as punishment or understanding. So the first thing that he talks about is aggression that is turned against the self. So the quote goes like this: his aggressiveness is introjected, internalized. It is, in point of fact, sent back to where it came from. That is, it is directed toward the ego, toward his own ego. So it's interesting because Freud starts from a point of aggression. Civilization needs to restrain human aggression, but aggression can't just be erased. Instead, it has to be redirected. So the aggression that the individual might have directed against other people is turned back against the individual's own ego. This means that guilt is not just moral understanding, it contains a kind of aggression. So it's like a part of the psyche starts to attack another part of the psyche. Then he continues, there it is taken over by a portion of the ego, which sets itself over against the rest of the ego as superego. So what he's describing is how the psyche becomes divided. So one part of the ego is elevated above the rest and given the authority to observe and judge it. So the individual now is the one being controlled and the agency carrying out that control. So the judge has become part of the self. Then he continues, the tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it is called by us the sense of guilt. It expresses itself as a need for punishment. This is Freud's definition of guilt. Guilt is the tension between a judging authority and the ego subjected to that authority. And importantly, that tension seeks expression through punishment. So it's more than just saying, I did something wrong. The guilty person experiences a pressure to suffer for it. So Freud ends the passage with, I think, the strongest image. Civilization, therefore, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. So the metaphor of the garrison, I already mentioned that. It's really important. A garrison is like an occupying force that's placed inside conquered territory. So it belongs to the system controlling the city, not the city being controlled. So what Freud is presenting is conscience as a form of internal occupation. So civilization controls aggression by installing its representative inside the individual. So the subject begins performing the work of civilization in themselves. They watch themselves, they judge themselves, and then they punish themselves. And those are the exact mechanisms that need to be questioned. Now, the second thing that Freud discusses is kind of like a guilt that is kind of like how guilt starts with the fear of losing love. And I think understanding that is really important. Like, it's something that develops throughout childhood, is what Freud says, what he claims. So basically what he's asking is how we first decide what is good and what is bad. And he rejects the idea that human beings possess some kind of an original natural ability to distinguish them. He says, what is bad is often not at all what is injurious or dangerous to the ego. On the contrary, it may be something which is desirable and enjoyable to the ego. And I think this is very important because it's like what is forbidden may be precisely what the individual wants. So the prohibition doesn't necessarily arrive from the desire itself. It comes from somewhere else. He says, here, therefore, there is an extraneous influence at work, and it is this that decides what is to be called good or bad. So the earliest moral judgment is imposed by an external authority. Why does the individual submit to it? Freud answers that. He says, such a motive is easily discovered in his helplessness and his dependence on other people. It can best be designated as a fear of loss of love. So, for Freud, guilt is deeply connected to dependency. The child needs the protection and care of more powerful people. Losing their love would also mean losing safety. It would mean risking survival. The child therefore learns to avoid whatever might cause that love to be withdrawn. Freud writes, at the beginning, therefore, what is bad is whatever causes one to be threatened with loss of love. This means that the first form of guilt is not an independent ethical judgment of some kind. It's attachment anxiety. The original question is, will I still be loved if I do this? And this stays with us. Refusing a request, for example, could feel like cruelty. Setting a boundary could feel like abandonment. Expressing anger could feel like becoming unlovable. The guilt may appear to concern morality, but underneath it is that the idea that disobedience is going to cost us love and therefore survival. The third aspect of guilt, of the guilt mechanism that he discusses, is the idea or is the process of external authority becoming superego. So initially he kind of refuses to call this fear like a genuine conscience. He says this state of mind is called a bad conscience, but actually it does not deserve this name, for at this stage the sense of guilt is clearly only a fear of loss of love. So at this stage the individual is like primarily afraid of being discovered. Like if the authority will never know, then there will not be guilt, right? And that changes when authority becomes internalized. So he says, a great change takes place only when the authority is internalized through the establishment of a superego. So once the superego has been established, then the person doesn't need to be watched from the outside anymore. He says, at this point too, the fear of being found out comes to an end. The distinction, moreover, between something bad and wishing to do it disappears entirely, since nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thoughts. And again, this is one of the most important passages of the text. So external authority can only discover actions. The superego can know your intentions. It knows fantasy. It knows wishes. It knows that you wanted to say no, but you said yes. It knows that you felt anger, even when you behaved politely. Stuff like that. So the distinction between the deed and the wish disappears. So the person can behave correctly and still feel guilty. Like they can obey and still be punished. Freud is showing us basically that guilt can't be treated as reliable evidence that like actual harm occurred. Guilt can be produced entirely by the conflict between desire and internalized authority. Nothing happened and you still feel guilty. So guilt doesn't always mean I harmed someone. It means a part of me wanted something that my internal authority doesn't allow me to have. The fourth important, significant part of guilt or aspect of guilt that Freud discusses is that obedience does not end guilt. So it actually doesn't work. The entire structure of the superego in relation to guilt is fucking useless. So one might assume that renouncing the forbidden desire would satisfy conscience, right? But Freud argues that this only works while authority remains external. So he says, originally, renunciation of instinct was the result of fear of an external authority. One renounced one's satisfaction in order not to lose its love. So the individual gives up the satisfaction and avoids punishment. The external authority, therefore, has no further reason to act. But the superego creates a very different situation. He says, here, instinctual renunciation is not enough, for the wish persists and cannot be concealed from the superego. So the action has been renounced, but the desire has not disappeared. And because the superego knows about the desire, obedience does not actually produce acquittal. He says, thus, in spite of the renunciation that has been made, a sense of guilt comes about. And this is the fucking trap. The individual sacrifices the pleasure in order to escape guilt, but the sacrifice itself does not free them from the guilt. And Freud describes this result as, quote, a permanent internal unhappiness for the tension of the sense of guilt. So the external threat has been avoided, but it has been replaced by permanent internal punishment. Then he goes further. He says, every renunciation of instinct now becomes a dynamic source of conscience, and every fresh renunciation increases the latter's severity and intolerance. The more the person renounces, the stronger the authority demanding renunciation becomes. That's what he's saying. Obedience feeds the superego. And this is why moral perfectionism doesn't actually necessarily reduce guilt. It can actually intensify guilt. So every fucking attempt to become perfectly good increases attention to thoughts, intentions, and desires. The person becomes more suspicious of their own motives. Like they expect obedience to produce peace, but instead the internal authority becomes more severe. So the superego, like when you did something, when you feel the guilt, right, which it imposes on you, it's not like you say, okay, I have obeyed this, so now I can finally rest. No, it learns that more obedience can be demanded from you. And then it fucking does it. Okay, another thing that Freud discusses in relation to guilt is how conscience watches actions and intentions. So in chapter 8, Freud distinguishes like several terms that he has previously used somewhat interchangeably. He says, the superego is an agency which has been inferred by us, and conscience is a function which we ascribe, among other functions, to that agency. So what that means is the superego is the psychic agency, right? And conscience is like one of its activities. And then Freud defines that activity. He says, this function consists in keeping a watch over the actions and intentions of the ego and judging them in exercising a censorship. Again, conscience does not judge actions only. It also watches intentions. So the term censorship is especially revealing here. Censorship, it's not like it doesn't just respond to something that has been expressed, right? It actually prevents certain material from becoming expressible in the first place. So the superego regulates not just what you do, but what you permit yourself to think, feel, and acknowledge. So Freud says, the sense of guilt, the harshness of the superego, is thus the same thing as the severity of the conscience. So guilt measures the severity of the internal judgment. It's not just knowledge that a rule has been broken. It's the ego's experience of being observed and condemned. He says, it is the perception which the ego has of being watched over in this way, the assessment of the tension between its own strivings and the demands of the superego. So, guilt emerges from this gap between what the ego strives toward and what the superego demands. And the larger the conflict, the greater the tension. So like a person wants something and then the superego says they have to not want it. And then guilt is the felt pressure between those two positions. Now, this is probably the most important part, in my opinion, in terms of like self-reflection and how we can get to a sense or to an unspooking, an attempt of unspooking. Freud talks about the sadistic superego and the masochistic ego. So he says, the need for punishment is an instinctual manifestation of the part of the ego, which has become masochistic under the influence of a sadistic superego. This is much stronger than the idea that conscience gently guides us toward better behavior. The superego is sadistic. It gains expression through attacking and punishing the ego. In Freud's dream theory, he talks about how the superego wants territory. So when you picture the superego, you always have to imagine it as an occupation. It wants to colonize you. And the ego, in relation to this colonization, becomes masochistic. It develops an attachment to being punished. So the guilty person could experience suffering as something that they need. And that is because punishment temporarily satisfies the structure of guilt. So the ego is always trying to satisfy guilt so that it leaves it alone. Stay away from me. It just tries to keep it away so it can exist, but it doesn't work. This is why we experience guilt as this pain that we have to overcome. Like it's like a thing that we have to beat, like something that has to go away. And then we just seek whatever we can find to eliminate it. And it doesn't work. So Freud describes it as, quote, an erotic attachment to the superego. And I think you can argue with that and you can question sexual references, but I think it's important. It's a helpful, useful image that we can have of our relationship to this structure, this mechanism. The relation between judge and defendant is not just imposed. The ego is psychically bound to the judge. And this helps explain why people can remain attached to self-condemnation even when they consciously want relief. It's like guilt, like giving up guilt feels dangerous to us. It feels like we might be abandoning morality, forgetting the harm, excusing yourself, losing your sense of self that you've attached to that authoritarian structure. So the ego is attached to punishment because punishment appears to preserve the connection to conscience. And this is where self-punishment can be mistaken for responsibility. So the individual suffers and interprets that suffering as evidence. I am in pain, therefore I understand. I hate myself, therefore I'm taking responsibility. But the suffering, what it's doing is it's only maintaining the relationship between the punitive superego and the punished ego. Nothing outside of that relationship changes. Well, it could, but not necessarily. Now, another thing that Freud discusses is like intended aggression becoming equivalent to action. So Freud returns to the difference between remorse and guilt. And he says, the term remorse should be reserved for the reaction after an act of regression has actually been carried out. Remorse follows an action, right? Something happened and the ego reacts to it. But guilt becomes more expansive after the formation of the superego. Freud says, owing to the omniscience of the superego, the difference between an aggression intended and an aggression carried out lost its force. The word omniscience gives the superego an almost divine quality here. Like it can't be deceived because it's part of the same psyche producing the wish. And this is where Freud concludes. He says, henceforward, a sense of guilt could be produced not only by an act of violence that is actually carried out, but also by one that is merely intended. And this is what makes guilt potentially unlimited. Like there are limits to what we do, but there are fewer limits to what we imagine. So aggressive fantasies and resentment and wishes are normal parts of psychic life. But under the superego, the person could potentially experience these internal events as moral crimes. Therefore, you can feel guilty without ever acting. And because unconscious conflicts don't disappear through conscious obedience, the source of possible guilt is fucking inexhaustible. And that brings us to the end of today's episode, which feels appropriate because after talking about guilt and shame for this long, I do feel like we should be emotionally compensated somehow. Like, I don't know, give me some snacks, give me some money. Give me a fucking... I want a formal apology from my fucking superego. Okay? That's what I want. That's what you should fucking ask for. Ask for a formal apology of your superego. Because if there's one thing that I want to leave you with, it's this. Guilt and shame are not the truth. They can be real feelings. They are valid feelings. They can be very intense feelings. They can arrive with the full dramatic force of a divine verdict delivered in thunder in the skies, whatever. But that does not make them sacred. Sometimes guilt points toward repair, and sometimes shame points toward something vulnerable. And those are good things. Sometimes we should listen to them. but most of the time, guilt is old authority, and shame is an internalized gaze. Sometimes the feeling that says you are wrong is not wisdom. It's fear, it's punishment, it's memory of losing love, it's someone else's demand. And this is why I think the question obviously is not simple, right? How do I stop feeling guilty? Or how do I stop feeling ashamed? It's not that easy. The more important question is, what is this feeling trying to make me obey? What is it protecting? What desire is it punishing? What law is it enforcing? Whose voice is speaking through it? Is there something real to repair here, or am I being asked to suffer as proof that I am good? Self-punishment is not repair. Submission is not repair. Obedience is not repair. It's not responsibility. It's not care. The need to be morally purified through suffering is not the same as actually doing something to help. And I think OWNNESS starts in this pause. It's this pause where you take a minute to unspook. And what you're unspooking is something between feeling and obedience. It's like this very small, short, rude and disrespectful pause after an accusation coming from inside or outside. And that pause is like every other kind of unspooking, not some heroic fucking thing. You know, it may not even feel like some big liberation. It's like all things in relation to unspooking, awkward, shaky, embarrassing, half believed. Maybe it doesn't even really feel real, you know, but it's something. It's like a crack, you know, because shame depends on being hidden and guilt depends on being obeyed before it's examined. The superego depends on being mistaken for the truth. The spook itself depends on not being named. So we have to name it. We have to name it. The guilt, the shame, the judge, the accusation, all of it. Like, it's material. It's something to analyze, something to use if it's useful, and something to repair through if repair is needed. Something to refuse if it only demands obedience. And something to laugh at if it's ridiculous, you know? Like, it's something to make our own. Because the goal is not to become innocent. Innocence is just another fucking courtroom. The goal is to become less ruled. So maybe the most disrespectful thing we can do to shame and guilt is to interrupt it. Send the cringe feeling to be submitted to the Creative Nothing ZINE issue 2, winter 2027. Repair what is real and refuse what is false. You know? I don't know, man. That is the work. That's the work that we have to do. We have to pause, we have to be disrespectful, and we have to say, let's think about this for a second. That's the act of unspooking in this case. Let the courtroom lose some of its power. Let the judge become a little smaller. Let the sacred accusation become a weird object that you can hold in your hand and look at. And if the superego starts yelling at you after this episode, please tell it respectfully from me, you are just some loud fucking voice in my head, and I will take a minute to figure out what the fuck is going on. There you go.
All right. Thank you for being here for my rant and my analysis, whatever you want to call it. And remember not to let the spooks get you.